Good morning.
Morning.
Before I start the talk this morning, just a couple logistical things. I don't know if people are aware who are online that we do have a little monitor here in the hall in which you can show up. So if you like to show up for people to be able to see your picture, make sure to have your video on. If you don't want to show up, then you can turn your camera off and then we won't see you. It's awfully nice to see people, and especially when people are asking questions, it's really nice to be able to see you there. And people who are out in the yard this morning, I had a good word from Joichi that it will not rain this morning. But if it does, feel free to come up to the Engawa here, and I think there should be enough room to be able to stay properly distanced there as well. So next week is one of the most important events that is held at the temple on a kind of regular basis, about once a year. We have a jukai, which is the ceremony of giving and receiving the precepts. And precepts are central to our school of Buddhism, to Soto Zen Buddhism. It acts as a kind of important initiation into the lineage. And while some people will receive the precepts in this formal way, many people won't. But the jukai is not just about people who are receiving the precepts in this formal way. It's about how the mind of the Buddha is cared for through time. And that the giving and receiving of precepts, while happens between a preceptor and people who are receiving the precepts, is really a celebration that is about the whole of the Buddha's awakening, the mandala of enlightenment, which makes up our world. I say that just to encourage people. Sometimes people feel pressured. They're like, if I don't take the precepts, can I really be practicing Buddhism? Yes. I had said last week that in some of the oldest writings about the precepts going back to Nagarjuna, he makes a very clear point that sometimes people take precepts formally, and sometimes people don't. But that's not the point. The point is sila. That's actually the word that is translated as precepts for us. Sometimes I wish we had translated it a little different, because precept sounds like rule. But in our tradition, although sila was oftentimes, ethics was also oftentimes investigated and maintained through systems of rules, the way that it is in our tradition today is not a series of rules. It's a series of invitations, really a series of questions about how it is that we live. So sila being one of the three facets of the path, we have to pay attention to how it is that our lives are. And I'd said last week that one of the things that to me is so important about jukai, so really beautiful about jukai, is that it involves giving and receiving. Because giving and receiving is itself sila. Giving and receiving is itself uncovering an ethical life. That we are constantly giving and receiving. We are giving and receiving our life from each other, not just humans, but everything. Your food, the birds flying through the sky, the clouds, the garbage truck, everything is in a constant process of giving and receiving life. Without those things, you wouldn't have a life. And without you, those things would not have a life. So the giving and receiving, which is at the basis of everything, right, is how we explore sila, how we explore ethics. That is the central heart of it. And so in the precepts, when people formally receive the precepts, in that initiation, there is a giving and receiving. And that's what the ceremony next week is about. Dogen Zenji, the founder of this particular school in Japan, has a writing called the Kyoju Kaimon, which is teachings on giving and receiving the precepts. And in the introduction of that, he says, the great precepts of the Buddhas are maintained carefully by the Buddhas. Buddhas give them to Buddhas. Ancestors transmit them from ancestors. So the great precepts of the Buddhas, maintained carefully by the Buddhas. I said last week, this is how Buddhas take care of us, is through the maintaining of this giving and receiving, maintaining the awareness of this giving and receiving, maintaining the waking up to this giving and receiving, which most of the time we take for granted, right? You just go around your house or your life and you're like, oh, a carrot, eat the carrot. Don't think too much about it. I mean, maybe you do, sometimes. But the giving and receiving that's happening there, so often we're just oblivious to it. We're receiving our life from the carrot. So the Buddhas maintain carefully the precepts, they maintain carefully the waking up to this giving and receiving. And as we wake up to it again and again and again, our life, the way that we conduct ourselves in our living, is profoundly transformed. Buddhas give them to Buddhas. In the Chinese, it says something a little more, this is originally written in Chinese, says something like, Buddha, Buddha, together. The characters mean like Buddha, Buddha, and the together is like reflecting each other completely. So the image I have is like a Buddha sitting right facing a Buddha. Their eyes completely interpenetrating each other. That the maintaining that the Buddhas do of this giving and receiving is the giving and receiving of waking up to giving and receiving, which is a Buddha meeting a Buddha, which is a Buddha caring for a Buddha. That's all maybe sounds a little zen-y, hard to grasp. Well, that's actually the point. It's not really supposed to be graspable. You can't just figure it out and then get with the program. You have to wake up to it. And you wake up to it again and again and again and again. So those Buddhas giving the precepts to the Buddhas, that deep reflection, that happens right here in your being, right at the center of your consciousness. There are Buddhas giving precepts to Buddhas. There are Buddhas waking up to giving and receiving. Now we know about that because there have been people who have woken up to that, made their life about waking up to it again and again and again, and then giving and receiving precepts. Giving and receiving the teachings of a Buddha, giving and receiving a Buddha, carefully maintaining. And we call those beings ancestors. So we can trace our lineage back all the way to Shakyamuni Buddha. A generation after generation, people who have engaged in this work. Some of them become carriers of the lineage. And they practice the giving and receiving. Right? They hand it down from generation to generation. Now that takes the work of all the beings of that generation. It's not just the person who's sitting in the seat of the preceptor. So next week I'll be sitting in the seat of the preceptor. That's not about Ejo being perfect or really being anything other than a center point for the practice of this whole community. For those Buddhas that sit in the center of your being, giving and receiving constantly. This is what we call an ancestor. And so an ancestor transmits the giving and receiving of a whole generation to itself. And so the precepts appear in the world. And they appear not as rules, they appear as ethical conundrums. Ancestors give us their problems. That's the great gift of the ancestors. They give us their problems. They give us their mistakes. Not their perfection in being able to hold tight to a specific image. Because these are problems of awakening. They're problems of waking up to that giving and receiving, which is at the center of our life. And they have struggled with it, as we struggle with it. And that struggle is illuminating. That struggle is freeing. Apart from the struggle, you're totally stuck. If you're not struggling, right, you're probably just averting your heart and your mind from the giving and receiving. Bodhisattvas have to have traction. This ethical work is not abstract and it's not objective. Okay? Those two words, and think about them. In fact, they're very related. For something to be objective, it has to get pretty abstract. And what I mean by that is if you're going to hold something as being objectively true, you have to buttress it with a whole bunch of assumptions and other things to kind of keep it up in the air. You have to stop meeting the actuality of the thing if you're going to try to nail it down objectively. But at the same time, if you just come into your subjective experience and you say, well, this is the way I'm experiencing it, so that's just how it is, then you're also stuck. And so the traction is about encountering real problems, real issues, real people, real world, right, that we're facing. I don't mean that just to say that what is sold to you as the real world. You know, like when you want to go to art school and people say like, oh, no, don't do that. It's not practical. That's not the real world. I don't mean that kind of real, right? I mean the actuality of your life. When we talk about awakening, waking up to this giving and receiving, sometimes different characters in Chinese are used and they get translated in different ways. And probably better not to make too big a deal of this, but it's something that I think relates to what I'm talking about here. One level of waking up to the giving and receiving is we call realization. And in this case, what I mean by realize, the character in Chinese, the Japanese reading of it is satoru, for those of you who speak Japanese. And when you say to satoru, means like you see the principle of it. It's not exactly intellectual, but it's like you see into. You see, oh, this is how it works. And there's a shift in your consciousness and something becomes clear. So that's one way that we wake up. That's one flavor of waking up. Another flavor of awakening to this giving or receiving is literally written to wake up. It's like waking up from a dream. Your perspective shifts. You don't just see into a principle, but the way that you see is radically changed. You go, oh, it's been here all the time. Have you ever had that experience? You're like, it's been here all the time. How could I not see it this way? And then the last way, oftentimes translated as actualization or sometimes verification. This means like to become it. Right? It's not something that we see into. It's not something that we wake up to and we see things only see things differently now. But the way that we are, When my teacher was teaching me about this, he said realization is like the principle. It's like seeing into the principle of it. Awakening is like the experience of it with your senses. Your senses shift. Like if you ever watch those puzzles things where you look at them and they just look like a bunch of funky dots, and you look at it in a and some place it goes boop, and it becomes a 3D picture. Those are actually very interesting. It has to do with the way your eyes are converging or not converging on the picture, which is a kind of cool metaphor for Buddha Dharma. But I won't get into that too much right now. If you're into that kind of thing, think about it a little bit. Something might start happening. So that's what the waking up is like. But the actualization or the verification, sho is the word in Japanese, gonben tadashi. This one is the embodiment of it. And I don't mean just the physicality of it. I mean the beingness of it. And ethics point us to this again and again and again. You may see things in a certain way. How are you in the world? Important question. How are you? Dogen Zenji goes on to say, receiving the precepts goes beyond the 3 times. Realization continues on a thread, unceasingly from ancient time to the present. So whatever it is that the Buddha woke up to, this giving and receiving, is timeless, is beyond time. We usually refer to it as ancient. But ancient here doesn't mean that it just happened a long time ago. It means that this is primordial. This is the way of life. This giving and receiving is at the root, has always been. Right? And the Buddha woke up to that. Before the Buddha, beings woke up to that. Now, after the Buddha, beings should be waking up to that. Because that ancientness is right now. The present. Because we think about the present and the past, there's this thread. There's a thread. That's what the lineage is about. There's a thread that comes down through time. But that thread is the actualization. Right? It is the conundrums. It is the problems of a human life. Right? Encountered again and again and again and again. Waking up again and again and again and again to this giving and receiving. A constant rediscovery. That's what the continuing on a thread is about. The constant rediscovery of the Buddha's maintaining the precepts. My teacher gave me almost no teachings on the precepts. Is a bit of deficiency in modern Japanese Zen Buddhism, in my opinion. I haven't told him that. But maybe next time I see him, I'll bring it up. But I asked him one time, the only teaching he ever gave me is he said the people don't keep precepts. Precepts keep precepts. Very Zen. I didn't know what he was talking about. But that's what I'm getting at here. Buddhas maintaining Buddhas. Precepts maintaining precepts. Constantly rediscovering the contours of giving and receiving. The way in which our life is informed when we wake up to that giving and receiving. In the ceremony that happens next week with the administering of each of the precepts, the preceptor will ask, from this present state to that of becoming a Buddha, will you maintain this precept or not? From this present state to that of becoming a Buddha, will you maintain this precept or not? And then if the people receiving the precepts are still on board, they will say, I will. And then they'll be asked again, and then they'll be asked again. And then they'll ask a whole series of precepts, and then they'll be asked again. Are you really sure? It's a rhythmic process. Actually, it's quite a meditation in this giving and receiving. From this present state to that of becoming a Buddha, will you maintain this precept or not? Is the giving of a question. It's an invitation to question, how is it that I wake up to the giving and receiving of my life? Not in an abstract way, but with the day-to-day living of who I am in my body and mind, in the set of causes and conditions or circumstances in which I live. It's giving a question to find the light in the mirror of things. Last week I was talking about this image of a mirror, that every phenomena we encounter is in a mirror. Right? It doesn't mean that those things are not real, but it means that they are essentially luminous. But we focus on them as things. We hold them as a thing. And as we hold them as a thing, an object out there, it's hard for us to see their luminosity. So what we're looking for in all of the practices, these freeing practices, freeing us from the cycles of suffering, is to tune into the luminosity, which I am involved in. There's a giving and receiving. That object is an object because I'm looking at it. I am a looker because I'm looking at that object. And that reflection is a giving and receiving. And the light, we use the term light, is present there. The luminosity is present with each being. So the question becomes, how do I do that? What is it to take refuge in the Buddha? That's the first precept. First three are refuge precepts. What is it to take refuge in the Dharma? What is it to take refuge in the Sangha? How do I entrust my life to awakening? How do I entrust my mind to a way of seeing the world that helps me overcome suffering and helps others overcome suffering? How do I come back to the people of my life who are trying to do the same thing again and again and again and again? Even though, if you hadn't noticed, people are annoying. Sometimes, at least, right? How do I come back? This is what refuge is asking us. How do I be willing to limit my behavior? How do I take on teachings that tell me, stop? This is the first pure precept, to embrace codes and forms, which usually throws people. They look like, codes and forms. We're not so into that today, right? But the codes and forms is just really about limiting behavior, about willing to say that the way you think it should be or what you feel like doing right now is not necessarily what should be done. To embrace that there can be limitations that you need to adopt. And in adopting that, something important happens. How do I embrace the way in which the world teaches me again and again and again? Everything I'm meeting is telling me about what it is to wake up. This is embracing good dharmas, the second pure precept. How do I embrace living beings? Of all the living beings. And in our tradition, we're not just talking about people. We're not even just talking about things that animate themselves, like a bird or a worm. How about a rock or a tree? All of these things are alive. All of them are beings. And how about all the countless beings which are inside of your own mind? The world that goes this direction, as well as the world that goes this direction. How will I look to meet their luminosity? These are the kind of questions, right? So you can hear them as a question, rather than as a just do it. Take refuge in the Buddha. Okay? Yes, okay. Sometimes it sounds like that. That's fine. But that should right away then give into the question. What does that mean to take refuge in the Buddha? If you knock on the Buddha's door, you say, oh, I'm here to take refuge. The Buddha might say, well, what does that mean to you? What do you want? What do you want from me? So we have to think about that. When we get to the prohibitory precepts, they're more concrete in a way. And I think a lot about how it is in our modern world, the way that things are right now, these precepts. And the first one, not killing. How do I, in a world where life eats life, that's how we stay alive, is by consuming life. In a literal sense of eating, but in the whole way that we make our lives work. In that kind of a world, what does it mean to not cut off life? To not turn that life-eating life into killing? That's a real conundrum. That's a real question. How could I live that out? The second precept, a grave precept, not to steal. In a world in which private property is the function of oppression, I mean, we have a whole society built on hoarding resources for certain groups of people, which we are all pretty high on the stack there, if you're in this room today. We have a whole structure built, a whole structure of private property built to uphold great suffering. What does it mean not to steal in that environment? It's not so clear. Like, okay, I'm not shoplifting nuts from Fred Meyer. I did that once. I wanted to see what it was like. I hadn't stolen anything in my life. I was in my early 20s. I was like, oh, I want to see what that's like. I was kind of in the anarchist phase, and I was like, oh, Fred Meyer doesn't really exist. It's just a thing that people made up. And there's papers, that says it's a thing, right? And these people own it and all that sort of thing. So I did, some batteries. One day of batteries and twice. I did twice. One day batteries and one day some nuts. I don't think it was right. It wasn't liberating particularly. Maybe a little bit. I got to see what that experience was like. Right? But it's a big conundrum. In a world where things that should be free are commodified. Even attention, even love. What does it mean not to take things that are not my own? Not to misuse sexuality. If we roll into that from the commodification in the second precept, what a world we live in where sexuality is on sale, used to entice. The images are everywhere. Deeply, deeply sexualized for the purpose of gain. Using sexuality. Sometimes I think that the translation of that should just be not misusing sexuality. It should just be not using sexuality. Like, I don't know how you would use it in a way that wasn't miss, right? If you're using it, it's a miss, right? But that's the translation we have. So not misusing sexuality. What is that like? What is it to be intimate? I'm not just talking about sexual activity, But sexuality, that coursing deep part of our being, which leads to procreation, but is not just about procreation, our passion. What would it mean to deeply respect that in ourselves and in other beings? We'll say that most of what passes as sexuality today, which it's just like doesn't even make it on the table. And not to lie, that's the fourth precept. We're in an environment where you just say stuff, right? You just say stuff. Do you know that 85% of people will believe a statistic if you just make it up on the spot? But we do that all the time. I'm not just talking about the current, fire monkey in the White House, but I'm talking about just us. We do that all the time. Say it with confidence, then it'll be true. Right? How could we say anything about anything, really, if we were concerned about misrepresenting? The fifth precept, not to deal in intoxicants. There's the typical culprits like beer and wine and cigarettes and marijuana and heroin and caffeine. And those all twist our mind. But we're awash in it. Every time you turn on the radio, in some early commentaries, they talk about music as being an intoxicant. How about news? How about the jolt of dopamine you get from the righteousness that you feel in relationship to other people who are, not wearing masks or something? Not saying people shouldn't wear masks. I'm just saying, what hit are you getting? I watched this or listened to this really interesting radio program where a guy was being interviewed, and they were checking his dopamine levels as he was talking, and this guy was making the radio program, and he said, I wish I had never done that, because when I listened to the transcript and I looked at my dopamine levels, they had the recording going, and then they showed what his dopamine levels were, and he said, I crack a joke every 1.5 minutes, and every time I do it, my dopamine goes boop, and he said it just destroyed him. Because it's his whole personality. He was like a fun person, and he thought, oh yeah, I'm really a fun person, I'm joking. And he was like, I just should have a little dopamine button. Probably a pretty healthy way to get your dopamine, by the way, if you're going to choose different ways, making jokes and bringing that, you're also giving someone else a squirt, so that's probably some giving and receiving is pretty good. But it struck me, like, what patterns do we have which are just about changing the chemical experience of our mind, or just changing the way that things are, and we're using that all the time. How do we use things to do that? We are awash in that, right? From TV to radio, music, chocolate, and all the normal suspects as well. So what would it mean to not deal in intoxicants? To not sort of try to get your resources by the give and take of intoxication. Anyway, I could keep going through these. There's several more, but I'm going to stop because we will run out of time. This is what I'm talking about. These are the kind of questions that come about when we take the precepts seriously. Not just as injunctions, but as invitations to a deep conundrum about how it is that I should live. And all of it is about waking up to the giving and receiving. When I meet you, right, how do I meet the not you? How do I meet the you that isn't this object of my perception, that isn't this thing that I've decided who you are? How do I not make you a project of my clinging and my rejecting. Even when I'm doing something good, oftentimes I'm doing that. Someone who's in need and you're helping them, that's a good thing to do, right? Are they a project of your clinging? Helping them? Or can you help them with a very clear and open mind, seeing their luminosity, not saving somebody who is down here and you need to pull them up, but seeing the Buddha that's right at the center of their being and caring for it, maintaining carefully the Buddha who is giving the precepts to the Buddha. This is why when we study ethics, especially if we're talking about the freedom of ethics, we're talking about ethics which is animated by prajna. Right? It's animated by wisdom. It's the perfection of ethics, or the crossing over from samsara to nirvana. That is ethics. Ethics is the crossing over. Prajna, or wisdom, is the crossing over. See, wisdom is telling us that we can't take our stand somewhere and just kind of carve out our place. We can't just carve out our ethical ground. Right? That we have to continually wake up to the ethical life. And in that continual waking up, there is a walking, there is a crossing over. This is what prajna tells us. Don't just say, oh yeah, I got it. I don't steal. I don't shoplift. No nuts, no batteries from Fred Meyer. Don't do that. So I don't steal. Baloney, you don't steal. Find out how you steal. Wake up to the ways in which you steal. This is what wisdom is asking us to do, not to just settle into our place. So when people ask to receive the precepts, I usually tell them it's going to mess up your life in a good way. I don't know, for people who are taking precepts. Did I tell you that, Michael? Okay, well, now you know. Yeah, it's a very good thing, actually. To be disturbed from our complacency. And this is something that the ancestors do for us by being willing to share their problems. And so we get to be together. Are there any questions or comments? Hi.
I'm wondering what it means to engage with Dharma, uphold Dharma, embrace the Dharma as not an object. We always talk about practice.
Yeah.
And I think we come to practice because we're grasping at that dopamine hit.
Yeah.
We're looking for that relief. We sit and feel better, and so we come back and we're in this game.
Yeah.
And so, what is it to engage with that not at the center? Like, how could that not be at the center?
Yeah. Can people hear outside of this? So what does it mean to engage the Dharma without making it an object? Right? So how can we engage good dharmas, teachings, practices, and not make it into an object, especially because we're looking for some relief. And in looking to some relief, when we come to the Buddha Dharma, we receive a teaching, right? So not just staying in that place. Is that?
Yeah.
Keep going. It's really, I think this is very important. In the Lotus Sutra, there's one of the central parables in the Lotus Sutra is called the parable of the fantastical city. And it's a story that the Buddha teaches in the Lotus Sutra where he says, it's as if there was a guide and he takes out a group of people across the desert. And it's a long, 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 long road. And along the road, he sees that everyone's getting very tired out, and they're getting worn out. And so this guide, he creates a fantastical oasis, right? It's a mirage, but they can all enjoy it. So they all come to the place, there's water, they're hanging out I always imagine there's a palm tree, and there's, maybe some pineapple juice, and people kind of hanging out, maybe taking a swim, and everyone's just enjoying this jeweled city. And they spend some time there, and then the guide takes it away, or just ceases the mirage, and then the road keeps going on. When I first read that, I thought it was like an admonition against the people who are in the castle, and that is one way to read it. You can read the Lotus Sutra as a kind of polemic against other forms of Buddhism other than the Mahayana, and saying that, okay, these are the people who are arhats think they've made it all the way, but they're just hanging out in this fantastical city, and actually the road keeps going on. So it's one way to read it. But the way that's more inspiring to me is the Buddha actually gives us a jeweled castle. The fruits of practice are real. They're real in the sense that they appear as a phenomena. Our mistake is thinking that it's the end of the road. And so when we practice diligently and we do experience some relief, something does turn over. But as the castle, as we experience more the way in which the castle disappears and we see the long road becomes more and more our home. And we learn to walk it, not just with the idea that we're going to get to the end of it, but we start walking the road as our own wandering, as our own life. And the road becomes our life. And all the beings we encounter on the road becomes our life. It's not a place to stop. It's a continual waking up to. So that dynamic is really, I feel like it's such a gift. And sometimes we really need to just take a rest in the fruits of what have come from our practice and from our life and the good karma that we've accrued. But when we stop there and we start just replicating it, then we create this problem. Traditionally, it would say that you will be reborn in the heavenly realms. So if you get really good at doing good things, you can make it into heaven. But Buddhism doesn't see that as a good thing. I mean, it's an okay thing. It's not a bad thing. But it's just not a final thing, right? We think it's a final thing. Oh man, made it into heaven. Cool. But the thing is, heaven is also in that cycle of coming and going. So our incarnation in the heavenly realm will only last for a period of time. And then it will also dissipate and we'll fall out of it. And the problem with the heavenly realm is we're unlikely to practice because we can't face suffering in the same way because it's so ungrounded from the world of suffering. This is the traditional kind of teaching. So that's a place you can watch. Am I like hanging out in the fantastic city and then I'm just kind of trying to make my way into the heavenly realm? Or am I staying connected to the road, which is my continual walking and walking together? The guide didn't just take one person. The guide took a group of people. And so we can be part of that. Anything else? I think we have time for one more if there's anything. If not, that's fine too. Okay. Questions?
You talked about the precepts, and like you say, do you agree to this precept, up until the time you become a Buddha? Yeah. Could you describe like what's in between, in a somewhat practical sense? I'm curious, and I know some people have asked, like, what's the relationship and the process of going from precepts to taking a teacher, and are there other steps before Buddhahood?
Oh yeah. Well, let's take the practical steps in terms of this tradition. Precepts is the primary. I'm going to use the word initiation, initiation into the lineage. And again, some people will do that, and some people don't. It doesn't mean that you can't practice in this school. It just means that is an important Dharma gateway, and is maintained. It maintains the lineage through time and through space. So that's the central one. And it's not just that we go from there in a progression, like going up a ladder. It's more like that's the center. For people, some people will take on a formal relationship with a teacher. So there's a number of people at Buddha Ai who are formal students of mine. And I think in the hall today, Issei, June, Kogen, Joichi, Anyu, Genjo. Anyone? Genki's preparing for, or actually, he's waiting for us to get our act together, for me to get my act together to schedule it correctly. Sorry, Genki. So that's a very special bond. And that relationship with a teacher where there is a accountability, mutual accountability to this waking up, there is with the precepts, but with a teacher-student relationship, it becomes about those two individuals' accountability to each other for awakening. So that becomes the kind of another place. That can happen as a priest, person who's training as a priest, or person who is a lay person. Or I prefer to say a not priest, because lay is it's a whole nother Dharma talk about the problem with the word lay. And then among disciples who are not in priest training, there are some who take on training to teach. And so those people are, in Buddha Ai Temple, we refer to them as koji. And so Myobun is the first in that group, and Anyu and Kogen. Kogen, who's the head student now, will be giving talks and doing his Dharma combat, etc. Now that's all about the functioning within Buddha Ai Temple, or within our tradition here. And it's all of those are based in precepts. So the precept is like a mandala. Every one of those is precepts again, precepts again, precepts again, precepts again, precepts again. Right? And then I don't have any Dharma heirs, but if that happens, that would mean somebody else who could also become a preceptor. Then that ceremony is also basically a precept ceremony, but it's secret in a dark room in the middle of the night with a red curtain. So you'll never, unless you become my Dharma heir, you won't know about that, or someone's Dharma heir, but you might. And those people then, that receive the transmission in that way become responsible for handing the precepts to other people in a precepts ceremonies. So that's all happening in this world. And this lineage, the way that lineage is going on. If we talk about from there to Buddhahood, then it's both totally immediate, like we are Buddhas. When I talk about this Buddha giving a Buddha that's right here in the center of your being, I'm not just waxing eloquent. I'm saying that awakened mind is completely full and present in every being, without exception. So it's not that the Buddhahood is a long way off. It's that for a whole world to have a Buddha arise in that world system is a rare and precious thing. And so we don't walk the road with the idea of like, when am I going to get to Buddhahood? When am I going to get to Buddhahood? We walk the road with the idea that we are walking with the Buddha right here on the road. And the more that I wake up to that, the more that my own veneration of the Buddha is enough. I think we had maybe one person on the online, and then we'll close. Yeah. Was someone online want to ask a question?
Yeah, I do.
Hi.
Hi. I had a question regarding the precepts, and kind of, I don't know, taking them to a hypothetical, like, extreme. You know, taking not stealing, for example. If stealing, like, if stealing is the line between, you know, death by starvation and living, then where does that come in? How would you approach that situation or situations like that?
Yeah. So that's why it's a conundrum, is that we and I love this about the practice of ethics, is it will require us to shed our, what's that fancy word, carapace? Like armor of righteousness. If we're really doing it, it will require us to humility, because we won't be able to do the totally satisfactory thing. What is satisfactory to us in our ideal of what is ethical. So, for example, in that case of food, receiving nourishment. You know, I know people who are like trying to be fruitarians, and they'll like hang out underneath a tree and they won't even pick, like trying not to even pick an apple. You know, it has to be always like falling from the tree or something. That they didn't keep that going for very long. In the traditional monastic or renunciate society, that it was that you would only receive food. You would never prepare food in any way. You'd only receive from other people. They would make an offering. So that was a way to ethical purity. But it also required other people who were farming the food, killing the animals, cooking it, doing all that kind of stuff to prepare the food that you would eat. So that also has some questions in it. So I think the way that we deal with it is we learn to let the question guide us, and we let the conundrum or the unsolvability of the ethical quandary remove our armor and feel into our humility and make our choice from that place. Make the choice from our place of humility, and then there's a way we find a way forward. That is continually showing us about the luminosity of our total interrelationship with other beings.
Thank you.
Yeah.